Hi, everybody. I hope you're all having a good weekend so far. And I hope you're having a good 2026 so far. Let me know in the chat how your 2026 is going so far. If you've been in my lives, then you know I've been working on a stupid paper for a while. And it was finally due yesterday, so now I'm free. So now I have time to do more lives, and I know that a lot of you are taking the January test that's coming up. So I definitely want to make sure that I go live enough to catch some of you who are taking the January test. So if you're studying for the LSAT, let me know how it's going. And if you're taking the January test, let me know that too in the chat. But I thought I might just hop on and put up one of the, I was going through my files from tutoring, and I like to go through my Zoom whiteboards, and I was going through my Zoom whiteboards and I came across this slide and thought this might be a good slide to throw up and talk about on my next slide. So here I am. Because I know diagramming is really tricky for a lot of students and it's really intimidating, but it will save you so much time and make getting through the questions a lot easier. So if you have time to try out diagramming before you take the test, I definitely suggest it if you are struggling with timing. And even if you're not struggling with timing, if you're struggling with really long stimuluses or stimuli, then using diagramming can really help. So if you're currently studying for the LSAT, feel free to let me know in the chat. And like I said, I was going through my files from just tutoring, and I love using Zoom Whiteboard. So I wanted to show just how I teach diagramming to my students when we first start out with diagramming. And I also think this is really good if you struggle with unless statements. And I know that unless statements seem confusing, but I promise they're not confusing. I promise you know how to do unless statements. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about like why diagramming is a good idea and how it helps to save time. So diagramming helps to save time because it really lets you focus on the logic. And when I talk about the logic, I mean the way that the argument is structured. So the LSAT is never testing you. It's never testing you on how much you understand the content of the stimulus. It's never testing you on that. What it's always testing you on is the structure of the argument. So that's why diagramming can be so helpful. And hi guys, if you're just coming in, I was going through some files from tutoring and I came across this slide, and I use Zoom whiteboard in my tutoring a lot, and so this was examples with a student of mine for diagramming conditional language. So I thought I'd throw it up here. Please feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat. But diagramming, I know it seems kind of scary or maybe intimidating, but it really isn't that bad. And you want to treat, hi Ray, you want to treat diagramming like something that's going to make your life easier, which it is. So when I say that, you may not think diagramming is necessary for these sentences, and they're not, and probably isn't necessary for these sentences, but think about the types of sentences you see on the LSAT. Those may require some diagramming. So I just want to go over like some of these examples, and if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. But for example, for this first sentence, if it is cold, I will wear a jacket. That one is pretty straightforward. I let my student choose the letters here. So she chose C and J, coat and jacket. So the sufficient condition is the C. On the left side is the sufficient condition. So that means it being cold is the sufficient condition. And then the arrow just tells us we're moving on to the necessary condition, and the J, jacket, is a necessary condition. So literally when I see the diagram in my head on test day, I'll read that and I'll think, if coat, then jacket. I know what that means. I don't need the extra words that make it more confusing. Once I get that locked in my brain, it makes it a lot easier to go through the rest of the stimulus. So that's why I really like my students to do diagramming. All of my students do diagramming, just how much depends on the student. I've had students who refuse to do diagramming, and then I win them over. But I've never had a student not do diagramming. So I definitely suggest trying it out, even if it's just a little bit. And hi guys for just stopping in, and please like and share if this is helpful. I'm really bad at reminding people to do TikTok things. So please, and I think I'm supposed to ask you for hearts. So please leave some hearts too. When you come up with your original sentence, so if coat then jacket, and this rule applies to everything. Sorry, I just noticed a mistake in my first one. See if you see a mistake that my student made in that first diagram. I'm glad that I caught that. Let me mark it. Can I mark it? Let's see. Oh, well, that's way too big. Okay, better. Sorry, guys. Want to be precise. Okay. So this first one says, if it is cold, I will wear a jacket. That always means if I'm not wearing a jacket, then it's not cold. So for that first sentence where it says, if it is cold, I will wear a jacket, anytime you get an if then, yeah, thanks, Ray. You got it. Good. That's perfect. You want to flip them and negate both of them. So I've never seen the word contrapositive on the LSAT, but it's called the contrapositive. But that rule applies to every conditional statement. So if you look at the sentence that's next door to it, if it is a flower, it is a plant, that one is done correctly. And you'll see it follows the exact same pattern. So in my head when I read that, I think if flower, then plant. And then when I see the contrapositive, I literally think if not plant, not flower. And I always tell my students, you want to become an LSAT machine. And I kind of sound like a robot or a machine right now. And that's what I tell my students, you need to become for the LSAT. So let's say this is a scientific passage. If they replace cold with some long ass chemical name or some crazy historical theme, it doesn't matter. Whether it says cold, it's one word, or something that's completely unfamiliar, just assign a capital letter to it and move on. The LSAT is never testing you on how much you understand the content. They're never, ever testing you on that. They're always testing you on, do you recognize patterns? And think about lawyers, lawyers who represent like software companies or coders or doctors. They don't, very few people have the time to learn both law and that subject matter. You just have to know enough to recognize the patterns that I'm showing you on this screen. And that's the same thing for the LSAT. So don't be intimidated when you start seeing like historical and scientific passages and phrases, because you just want to treat them exactly the same as if it was as simple as what's on the screen here. If you look at the second row where it says, I will wear a jacket if and only if it is cold, I have my students do the double arrows just because that means that both things will always be happening at the same time. And I know that because it says if and only if. If is a sufficient condition indicator. And you can see that in the sentence above. If it is cold, always on our left-hand side is our sufficient condition. Cold was our sufficient condition. If we go back down to our second sentence, the sentence below, it also says, and only if. Only if is a necessary indicator. So because we have if and only if, it's going to go in both directions. That also means if you don't have one condition, then you don't have the other condition. And it's kind of crossed over, you can see, but you can see where I have crossed out cold, crossed out jacket. I have both conditions crossed out because they both are sufficient for each other and they both are necessary for each other. So anytime you get if and only if, it means those things have to happen at the same time. And please like and share if this is helpful. Hey, David. I'm not ready to dox myself yet, but probably soon I will be. I don't know, do you tutor the LSAT next? I do tutor the LSAT. I took the LSAT in 2020. I took it when I had logic games on it. I'm trying to figure out how to do like Tik Tok classes or YouTube classes. So if you have ideas, let me know. I'll be working at a law firm in New York next year, and I definitely won't have time to do LSAT tutoring then. And I'm in which is crazy, I have 1 semester of law school left. And that means that I probably won't have a lot of time this next semester, but that also may not be true. If you don't know, so if you're in your third year, you call it a 3L, and we call it 3LOL, because by the time you get to your third year in law school, you kind of feel like you're done with it, and that's kind of really what your last semester feels like. So that should give you hope. This is all very rough right now. If you talk to any lawyer and tell them you're studying for the LSAT, they will look at you with like sympathy eyes and be like, oh, I remember how hard that was. It gets better. It doesn't get easier, but it gets better. What did I study in undergrad? I studied sociology and speech language pathology. So like speech therapy. I'm always saying during my chats, if you can get into something scientific in undergrad, that will set you up really well for law school, because more and more law firms are needing like really, I don't know, AI, people who know AI and people who know engineering and science things. Obviously, that's not me, but you can tell that by the way I'm speaking, not me. But I've always wished I had a scientific-minded brain, because you make yourself really, really valuable if you have that. So there's a tip if, and even if you didn't go to undergrad for that, even just learning it in your own time is still worthwhile and impressive. I actually did, did I apply to University of Michigan? I did. I think I got waitlisted. Or, hold on. I actually still have my, list, my, list. Yeah, I got waitlisted, at Michigan. Okay. So this next, let me put my mouse where I'm looking, where it says, it is a flower if and only if it is a rose. Obviously not true, but I just wanted to show how it is diagrammed exactly the same way as if and only if is diagrammed over here. So you really want to think about the LSAT in terms of patterns, not so much worrying about like remembering the content. And please like and share if this is helpful. Oh, I wanted to run a poll to see what I should do my next live on. So I think can I do 2 polls? Because I want to know. Okay, I'm going to leave this poll up first, just to see if you guys who's studying for the LSAT right now, or who's just listening for fun. And if you're listening for fun, I think that's really cool. And if you're studying for the LSAT and listening to this, I also think that's really cool. Let's take a look at the next pair. If it isn't hot, I will wear a jacket. And see, just made H. If it's not H, then I will wear a jacket. Not hot, jacket. And then the contrapositive, if I don't have a jacket, then it must be hot. I'm going to skip down to one of these. Oh yeah, no, this is a good one. Unless, because all of my students, they really struggle with unless at first. And I mean, I also struggled with unless at first. So like when I studied from like March to August, and it was like, I didn't have a tutor. I just opened the Power Score books and I just like took notes on every single chapter. So I also had every single one of these struggles. But unless isn't as scary as you think. And I always tell students, if you're getting confused on the exam, like you get an unless sentence that's confusing, think about an unless scenario that you know in real life. So when I say that, I mean like if you're reading like a scientific stimulus and it has like a bunch of crazy, I don't know, chemical names in it, and you're getting confused about like how the unless is structured, like I would literally think of an unless sentence that made sense in my head, and I would diagram it just like I have this one here. Like the game will be canceled unless it is nice outside. And I would think through my head what that meant, and then I would compare the really complicated stimulus to that. So I always tell students, you always have something, the key to the LSAT is remembering you always have things to fall back onto if you've learned the patterns. So, for example, the game will be canceled unless it is nice outside. So my students, I come up with different rules based on my different students. But some of the rules that help my students for unless is you cancel out the first condition and you keep the second one. So the game will be canceled unless it is nice outside. You can see here my student crossed out canceled, so not canceled, meaning it happened, not canceled. Arrow, that means it's nice outside. And then from there, you can make the contrapositive. If it's not nice outside, then it's canceled. So one rule for unless is, and if you choose not to do diagramming, you can think about this however you want. But all that means is when the first thing doesn't happen, the second thing happens. So here, when the game is not canceled, that means it's nice outside. So if you get unless, that means if the first condition doesn't happen, then the second one does. Irene, how do you feel about other tutors saying diagramming is a waste of time? I think that's rude. And I think, no. And I've never had, I was just saying this earlier, I've never had a student not do diagramming. I've had lots of students come to me refusing to do diagramming, and I almost always convince them, and then they love it. And the reason why I think diagramming is so helpful is because think about it, it makes the information much easier to manage. And for when I say that, I mean the diagrams, C could stand for anything. C could stand for some crazy chemical name or the name of some like contemporary art movement. C could stand for whatever. But reducing it down to just like C and you knowing what that stands for makes it a lot easier to focus on just the moving pieces. Now, is diagramming necessary for every stimulus? No. And I would say like you can't, like if you diagram for every stimulus, you're probably not being efficient. So most of my students break out diagramming only when they're getting really long stimulus or when they have parallel reasoning questions, because on parallel reasoning questions, and this is another place where diagramming is extremely helpful, parallel reasoning questions are just matching the structure. So if you diagram the structure of the stimulus and then you diagram the structure of the answer choices, you're just looking for the diagrams that match. You're no longer like trying to think like, does this chemical mean like this? Is it an analogy or analogous to this condition in the answer choice? When you can compare the diagrams, it just makes it so much simpler and faster. So parallel reasoning questions, most of my students use diagramming on. When they get, sometimes my students, they won't do diagramming right away. And then if they hit the answer choices and then the answer choices make them realize they need to do diagramming, then they'll go back and they'll diagram really quickly. I mean, I don't love that but I think to each their own. I would definitely say don't try out diagramming on test day. So if you have tests coming up, try out diagramming just like on a couple questions at least, or maybe a little bit more, but just like some questions before test day. I always tell my students, test it out. Another question I get a lot is, should you read the question stem first? And like, I'm a huge don't read the question stem first tutor, but some of my students still sneak it in, obviously, and I think that's good because everyone's brain works differently, so you should do what works for you. But I don't think you should read the question stem first because the LSAT is literally built to trick you. And they know that when Isabella, they did take out game questions. This is for logical reasoning. They did take out the game questions. But I had to take, I think might have been the last one to take the games. No, I don't think that's true. But I took the games. Um, yeah, no problem, Isabella. Um, some students like to read the question stem first. I tell students not to because one, I think it's a waste of like it creates more cognitive load. And when I say that, I mean it puts more work on your brain than it needs to, right? Than you need right now. Because if you read the question stem, then you are spending time reading the stimulus, but also thinking about the question stem in the background and trying to anticipate what types of things they're going to ask you about. The LSAT, they know that you're going to do that, and they know what you would think to look for, and they know to put that in the answer choices. And so that's when the LSAT starts to feel impossible, when you start falling into every one of their traps. And so for my students, we literally treat every single question the same. And the reason we treat every single question the same is because it saves cognitive load. Instead of switching your process based on every single question, if you just, and of course this is the like LSAT snobby me coming out, but if you do the process correctly every single time, you're going to pick up on you're going to know what to either go back for, or you're going to have already caught what's coming up in the answer choices. And so when I say that, like what I have my students do every time is like every time they read a stimulus, after they read a sentence, they translate it in their head. If it's a sentence that feels impossible to get, they keep reading, because a lot of times your understanding will get fixed if you keep reading. I can't tell you how many times I've had students reading out loud to me, and they're like, they get so frustrated, like, I do not understand what that means, and they're asking me, and all I have to say is like, well, let's just keep reading and find out. And then they read the next sentence. They're like, oh. So I make my students translate in their own words every sentence. If they're struggling with a sentence, keep reading. And then when they're done, they summarize it in their head. And that could also mean like taking notes or diagramming, but they just run through in their head. And it literally could be something like, okay, if she wears a coat, if it's cold outside, then she's wearing a jacket. If she wore a jacket, that means that she went to the party. Okay, I get it. Now I'm going to go to the questions. And then the last thing they have to do is identify, if there's a conclusion, what the conclusion is. And then they take a look at the question stem and go to the answer choices. Hi, Bella. Can you go over weak and strong wording? Yeah, I could definitely talk a little bit about weak and strength wording. So for weakened questions and strengthened questions, actually, so good thing you asked about both. One of the trickiest things, I think, is, well, it's not tricky once you recognize it, but one of the traps they said is strengthening or weakening the premise, but not the conclusion. And I've given this example a couple times, but I think it's a good example. But when I say that, I mean, you want to literally look for words that show up in your conclusion to show up in your correct answer choice. And I literally mean like the words, like the same words. If your answer choice is not mentioning any word that is mentioned in the conclusion, you really want to think about whether that is weakening or strengthening the conclusion. So one example of this, and if you come to my lives, you heard me give this, but I think it's a good one to hear. I was doing a question review, and there was like a stimulus where they said they sent out a survey to their customers, and like 100% of the customers who returned their survey said they disliked the new product. And the conclusion was, "Hi, Reeves. I'm sorry I canceled on you the other day. Um, I was going to go live, and then I started not feeling great." So one stimulus said we sent out the survey. Everyone who returned their survey said they disliked this product. And that must mean that all of our customers dislike this product. My student chose the correct answer choice. An answer choice that said, we sent the survey out to like 100,000 people. Well, that sounds kind of convincing for strengthening. 100,000 people is a lot of people. But we don't know how many total customers these people have. What if they had like, I don't know, 500 million customers? Is 100,000 really that big? And did it have to do with the conclusion that all of our customers dislike our product? It didn't. It only had to do with the premise. The correct answer choice was actually one that said something like, the people who the people who respond to surveys show the same attitudes about products as all of the customers, or something like that. But it directly talked about the result of the conclusion that all customers dislike the product. And so that type of situation I think is really tricky. So I like the way that you asked your question, Bella. Can you go over weak and strong wording? Because it really is about the wording. It really is about the wording. And you want to make sure that you're choosing an answer choice that uses wording borrowed from the conclusion. So even if you don't understand what the conclusion means, because I can't tell you how many times I've read the LSAT and I'm like, what the F does that mean? And I like have no idea. Like I thought I was smart and I thought I understood things, but I don't. It doesn't matter. You just have to pay attention to the wording. So you just have to match the words. That was a good question, Bella. And if you guys are just joining, I'm going through some of my files with my students, because everything like on my profile, they're all stuff that like examples I've made up with my students and things. And please like and share if this live is helping. And please, I'm supposed to ask for heart me's, so please send me heart me's or join my fan club, because I also know I do want to start going. I've been saying this a lot. I want to come up with a live schedule. I'm just trying to figure out how to make that work. So give me some encouragement and ideas. Tyrika, is that for both question types? For both weaken and strengthen, Tyrika? Yes. You want to make sure for weaken and strengthen, always weaken and strengthen the conclusion. Bella, can you go over assumption questions? And Savannah, yeah, assumption questions, they seem really tricky. But you can almost always recognize an assumption question, because when you read it, when you read the stimulus, you should get a feeling of that doesn't really make sense. And generally for sufficient assumptions, and this can happen for necessary assumptions, but actually I would say I'm going to take back what I just took back. I'm going to say for all assumptions, you typically feel like you don't have all the information. And usually that means, if we're thinking about words here, which I always tell my students to think about words, which I know that sounds silly, but think about the words, that's puzzle pieces. If you see something in the conclusion that does not show up anywhere in the premise, so in other words, anywhere, any other sentence, then you're likely dealing with an assumption issue. So assumption questions are looking to see, can you bridge the gap? So sometimes the gap is between premises. Sometimes the gap is between premise and conclusion. But assumption questions are always filling a gap. So when they say you're looking for what is an assumption that is required, or sorry, like the argument requires, or which of the following is an assumption required, or which of the following does the argument rely on or depend on? All of those are synonyms for necessary, rely, depend, whatever else I just said. It's a little late. Those are all synonyms for necessary assumptions. So if you're getting a question that's using a synonym for necessary, then you want to think, and I typically have so a lot of you probably heard the negation test, so I'll explain it that way. If you're seeing those synonyms for necessary show up in the question stem, then that means you want to figure out which answer choice the argument needs. One way to do that, this is not the only way to do that, one way to do that is to cancel out the answer choice. So if you cancel out the answer choice, meaning if you negate it, add the word not, make it opposite, and the argument, and it doesn't crush the argument, then it is not your answer choice. In other words, the correct answer choice, you'll know you found it when you cancel it out, and then that makes the argument not work. The other thing that I tell my students, which I think is a little bit easier, is that the premise plus the correct answer choice should bring you to the conclusion. And so I always tell my students to think of it kind of as a formula. Your correct answer choice should be able to fit right in with the sentences in the stimulus that come before the conclusion or after the conclusion. But assumptions are always going to be asking you about a gap between the conclusion and the premise. So anytime you see words showing up in the conclusion that do not show up in the premise, that means that you are going to likely be getting an assumption problem. And so sometimes my students will read, and then when they get to the conclusion, they'll get frustrated and they'll start thinking they didn't understand the stimulus. No. It's not that you didn't understand the stimulus. So if you start getting that feeling, it's probably going to be an assumption question. If you look at my profile, Bella and Savannah, I have some good assumption posts, but I also have like a pack. I did like 3 posts where I put my, it's called like the assumption study pack. You should see it in my profile. I think it has like a dog on it. But gives the rules for necessary and sufficient assumptions. So take a look at those. Tyreeka, I think that answers your question. Oh, hi, Galavies. Oh yeah, let's get Reeves up here. This is fun. Okay.
I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that.
No, I love that you're here. Now you have to ask me a question.
Okay. Um, could you explain premise? I know this is great, but can you explain premise from evidence?
Yes. So, premise is the exact same thing as evidence. So that's actually awesome that you said that. So the
Okay.
premise is the same thing as evidence, is the same thing as facts, same thing as background information. Well, I'm sorry. I should have said the premise is the same thing as facts, but it is evidence. So essentially, anything that is not the conclusion is going to be all premise.
Okay.
All right, I'm glad that I might actually do this more. I need to do some calling, but I like that you made me test that out. Do you have any other questions you want to ask me while you're up here?
No, not right now.
Okay. All right. It was good to talk with you, Reeves.
Good talking to you too.
Bye.
Bye.
I need to do that more. Would you guys let me know in the chat? Would you guys join if I did like let you guys join as guests and ask me questions? That was fun. Um that's honestly kind of what I would love to do. Oh my gosh, Galavies, really? Okay, that's cool. Awesome. Maybe I'll do that. I just the this is my problem, guys. I need your help. I have ADHD. I do not have the time or the energy to figure out how to do TikTok things. So, if you well, I think I could just do that. I don't know what I'm asking. I just know that I need help. If you know someone who helps people, send them my way and I'll give them LSAT tutoring. Um, and this is exactly why I want to do like online tutoring because I love explaining the LSAT, answering questions. Um, but it's a lot to take on like one person's whole LSAT journey, and I just don't have the energy for that. I'm getting old now, and especially because I'll be working at a firm next year. In New York City, I for sure won't have time. I didn't know that, Tyrika. I didn't know that it only allows a certain amount of words when commenting. Okay, that is good to know. How many of you are taking, let me know if you're taking the January test. Um, I can't tell how many people who've been watching are like coming up on the January test. Um, oh, you are, Savannah? Well, good luck. The fact that this is a perfect way to prepare. I always tell my students to kind of try to chill out a little bit before the January test, before the test. And when I say chill out, I just tell them to like read, listen to things. So I think that's perfect. Oh, you guys are gonna do great. Oh good, we have both good February and January. Um, yeah, I know how stressful it is. I don't think I slept like at all the night before my LSAT, but I'll tell you guys, adrenaline like almost always kicks in on test day. So if you're worried about that, you're gonna be just fine. But definitely make sure that you are staying hydrated and eating well up to before your test day. Um, because I think we don't talk about that enough, but you definitely want to make sure your brain is in the right headspace. Um, Atlanta Real Estate Goddess, I love that. I'm just starting. What's the best book for studying? I always recommend the Power Score books. I used them, and I took the test when it had logic games on it, so I used it for logic games and logical reasoning. I didn't really use anything for reading comp, but that's kind of a me thing. But for logical reasoning, I really like Power Score. They sell these right now. They sell these like little workbooks. I don't think the workbooks are worth it, but the big books, the like logical reasoning Bibles, I think are really good. Um, and I mean to learn, I literally just like opened it up and had a notebook and took notes starting from page 1. Um, a lot of people have come in here and really like loophole. I still need to check it out. I don't know enough to like say what I think about it. But yeah, I really like Power Score. Bella, can you talk up and Atlanta, I also think the resources on Law Hub are actually pretty good. I was clicking through them the other day. They're actually pretty good. So they have like articles and some like study guides. Those are actually really good too. Perfect. Yes, I'll put this on YouTube. Yeah, I'll put this on YouTube. Maybe not today, but it'll be on there tomorrow. Oh, Galaviz, you had problems logging into LSAC. Guys in the chat, let Galaviz know if anyone else has had any problems, or do you think it was just like your account, Galaviz? I really hate logging into LSAC. I swear I end up changing my resetting my password every single time. It's very annoying. Bella, can I talk about reading comprehension? Yeah, I could talk a little bit about reading comprehension. My biggest suggestion for reading comprehension is like bringing over all of your logical reasoning skills on over to reading comprehension. So you still want to keep reading for conclusion words and premise indicators and sufficient necessary indicators, like if why is my brain blanking? Like therefore, because those are all still equally, and I would say possibly more important on the reading comprehension, because the LSAT asks about those things still, but in a different way. And they know that your brain isn't thinking in logical reasoning, you're thinking in reading comp, so they know they're going to catch you off guard. So I always tell my students, just treat reading comprehension basically like another long logical reasoning section. You want to be looking for all the same structures. For example, the way that you notice if you're being given examples in logical reasoning, you want to pay attention, are you being given examples in reading comprehension? The same way you want to notice, is someone giving statistics as their evidence in logical reasoning? You want to notice when an author is giving statistics and data to support their reasoning in reading comprehension. So that's my biggest suggestion for reading comprehension, just changing the way you think about it. The other thing I would say is for main point questions, when they ask about the main point of the passage, you want to focus on the first paragraph and the last paragraph. The last paragraph is the one that the students don't think about much, but almost all the time, that sounds silly, I would say like 99% of the time, the correct answer choice on those main point of the passage questions always is something that connects the last paragraph and the first paragraph. And I know that because when I go through the wrong answer, when I go through my student questions with my students and reviewing answer choices, when we go over reading comprehension, I make them go back in the passage and say, okay, where was the answer? And 9 times out of 10, the answer for those main point questions is in those both the first paragraph and the last paragraph. And so many times my students have overlooked the correct answer because they didn't catch something that was at the end of the passage, and that was what was mentioned in the answer choice. And that's like not an accident. Like the LSAT they're doing that on purpose. So I always tell my students this too, like the things on the LSAT, like those are not things that are written, like those are not generally things that have been found on the outside that they're bringing into the test. No. Most of these things are things that they wrote to F with you. Like they knew exactly how to write the sentences because they knew your brain would skip over the word most. And they would know that when you read, you would skip over this sentence in the middle that was actually the conclusion. And they know that when you went to the answer choices, you're going to read that answer choice and it's going to sound exactly like how you remember the stimulus, because they know that's how our brains work. And they also know that is not the stimulus. So if you're feeling like frustrated, like, oh my gosh, this is really hard, I can't get it, I don't know, any of those feelings, yeah, like they literally, like, they built it that way. Like, this is not the normal way things look on the outside world. Like, I can tell you even that from law school, like, well, sometimes there have been times where I've seen things that sound like LSAT passages in law school, but not all the time. It's not that rare. And you'll hear most people say, I kind of disagree, but most people will say the LSAT doesn't help you with law school. I don't think that's true, but whatever. But if that's comforting to you, hang on to that. Galavies, I feel like I have ADHD. We can't be still. Yeah, Galavies, that is really hard. And it's also like we're not built to sit down for like 3 hours and just think full power 100%. Like, that's not how we're meant to be. So all of my students struggle with that. I struggle with that. So definitely remember, it's like preparing for a marathon. I've never prepared for a marathon, but this is how I'm assuming people do it. They don't start out running the 26 point, what is it? Someone help me. 3, 5, 2 miles. They start out by running a little bit, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and then I don't know what they do with their speed, but I'm imagining they get faster the more they practice. You could tell I'm not a runner. Same thing with LSAT. Don't expect yourself to be able to, like, full throttle sit down for 3 hours. Not that I'm saying that that's what you're expecting, Galavies. But definitely, if you find yourself having problems with that, with like the staying focused, I have my students just like set a timer one day, and I tell them to work for as long as they possibly can. And then like they see how long that is. And then we like work that amount of time for the next few days. And then we try to push it a little bit longer and a little bit longer and a little bit longer. But yeah, but I definitely have had students who get accommodations. And it's usually just like talking to psychiatrists and doing tests. You just have to find, I don't know. It's always a hit or miss because like some psychiatrists, they're just like they won't entertain that kind of talk at all. But yeah, that's basically what you just want to look up, like a psychiatrist in your area, and talk to them about whether you have it or not. Can you talk about weak and strong wording in the answer choices? Yes. So both, and that's a good question, Bella. So both weaken and strengthen questions can bring in new information. Weaken questions, I remember, would always catch me off guard because I just like, they were always felt like weird things that I would never think of on my own. And the way that I got around that was actually staying really focused on the conclusion. So, well, staying focused on conclusion, and also meaning the correct answer choice needs to contain words from the conclusion. So you need to know what the conclusion is. Your answer choice needs to contain words from the conclusion. And then 2, you want to ask yourself, so what? And when I say that, I mean, after I read like an answer choice, I'm asking myself, how does that impact the argument? And does that impact the conclusion? If it only impacts the premise, then it's not going to be your answer. Some common weaken, and I also would say this, if you are struggling with weaken and strengthen, reviewing flaws is very helpful, because weaken and strengthen weaken questions, you're trying to basically make a flaw happen, or make a flaw almost happen. So for example, if you're reading a stimulus, and it's a cause and effect stimulus, you're looking for ways to weaken the cause and effect. Some common ways to weaken cause and effect is the cause happening without the effect, the effect happening without the cause. The two being caused by a third thing. So not those two things happening at the same time aren't because of like cause and effect. It's actually because of a third thing. One of the most straightforward but trickiest ways to attack cause and effect, just to introduce another cause. And that's one that gets looked over a lot because it seems kind of obvious. But often in weaken questions, if it's cause and effect, the weaken correct answer choice will literally just say like another thing can cause it. That's super common. I'm trying to think of what else I've seen off the top of my head in weaken and strengthen answer choices. Yeah, I think I would just say, to get better at weaken and strengthen, review flaws. Because those flaws are the way you weaken and strengthen. Because, this is what I was saying earlier. You can tell I have ADHD. Weaken questions, you're making a flaw happen. Strengthen questions, you're trying to make sure that flaw does not happen. So it's like strengthen questions, you're trying to like plug up the hole. Weaken questions, you're trying to make that flaw happen. And thanks, guys, for the follows. I love getting new followers. And if you're taking the LSAT soon, definitely check out my profile. I've been posting things that I've used in sessions, and I'm going live, and I keep promising live section reviews. It's gonna happen. I'm just gonna figure out how. And please like and share if this is helpful. But I hope that helps Bella, so you can have new information and weaken and strengthen answer choices. They typically will include words from the conclusion. And if you want to weaken something, you're trying to make a flaw happen. So if you can identify what a flaw would be, then you can try to find a way to make that happen in the answer choices. I mean more as in, like, for example, weaken and strengthen, the answer choices will have strong answer choices. Can you give us an example of each one? Like almost many. New Zealand, that's amazing. Galaviz and Bella, let me think a little bit more about weaken and strengthen. I'm going to think a little bit more about those ones. As New Zealand, that's amazing. Great job. Yeah, that's so great. Yeah, that's the key, New Zealand. There's no secret key. Well, New Zealand figured out what the secret key was. Breaking the test down piece by piece, going very, very slow, and like going for accuracy. Because there's no secret to understanding the really long sentences and the really long stimulus or the really long arguments. It's just literally like stopping in the middle of a sentence and like checking to make sure that you understand it, and then going on to the rest of the sentence. Are there any tips to making inference questions easier? Kayla, with inference questions, and tell me, do you mean that? Well, this applies to both logical reasoning and reading comp. But I'll let you tell me which section you're talking about specifically, if one. But for for both, the LSAT considers an inference to be two premises added together. So in our, like, I don't know, in school we're taught like an inference is your best educated guess or an educated guess. On the LSAT, it's not a guess. It is not a guess. It is very formulaic. It's literally like a math formula. Like, you should be able to add two sentences together and come out to the conclusion. So for example, in this first sentence on my screen right here, where it says, if it is cold, I will wear a jacket. An inference is, if I don't wear a jacket, then it's not cold. And that's actually the only inference we can make from that statement. Yes. And yes, Raves, you're exactly right. That's exactly right. That would be two pieces of evidence together to come to a conclusion. Exactly. So your inferences are always going to come directly from statements in the stimulus. Another example, I don't have my whiteboard set up, but another example for an inference would be like, I think that one might be too complicated, but yes, I'll just keep it as it's combining two sentences or two statements, two premises to come to a conclusion. And that's always going to be your definition of an inference on the LSAT. So it's never going to just be a guess. It's always going to be something that's like logically provable. And when I say that, I mean that it follows like the rules of conditional logic. And yeah, I think that's what I would say. Yes, Kayla, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. The inference is the conclusion. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. Bella, about your question earlier with weaken and strengthen questions, and the most, some, many, all, I'll have to do a post about that, I think. Or maybe I'll do a live about that. But if you want to weaken something using most, saying most things go against the conclusion would weaken it, if that makes sense. Yeah, Bella. So for weekend questions, what I do, what I have my students do is we read the stimulus, we identify the conclusion, we identify the premise, and then after we read the stimulus, I'm always asking my students, how does that sound to you? Does that sound like a good argument or a not good argument? Sometimes they say, I don't know, and that's also totally fine. Sometimes they have an idea, and then I'll ask them why. So I always make them predict before they go into the answer choices. So if they think it's not a very good argument, I want them to predict why, or explain why it's not a good argument. If they think it is a good argument, I will ask them, can you think of something someone will argue against if they had to? And so those are the questions you want to ask yourself. Is this a good argument? If you think it's a good argument still, then think about, can I think of anything someone might argue with this? And then going to the answer choices, and I'd say about like 7 times out of 10, the answer choice matches your prediction. There's always ones where the LSAT knows exactly what people will predict, so they don't put it on there, which stinks. And then that's when you have to go back to, okay, I'm weakening the conclusion. I want to make sure that words from my conclusion are showing up in my answer choice. I want to make sure that the answer choice is not just focused on the premise. Yes. Is there a method for weaken? Is there a way to know the answer? Bella, for weaken, the way to know the answer is by identifying the one that impacts the conclusion. I think that's the best I can give for now. I'll have to go over some weekend questions this week. But many times on weekend questions, when we review them, my students will say like, oh, I don't know why I chose this answer choice. It has nothing to do with the conclusion. And then we look at the correct answer choice, and I'll ask, like, do you notice anything about the correct one? And they'll be like, I don't know why I didn't choose that. It uses words from the conclusion. So I think that tip will probably do a lot of help for you, hopefully, because that's a very, very, very common thing that happens with students is like for weekend and strength questions, they realize like, oh, this is the only one that talked about the conclusion. How can I get faster at reading comp without cutting corners? So Kayla, one of the things I always tell my students for reading comp is to remember you're not reading to understand the details, but you're reading to understand how the details are presented. So when you're reading, let's say they give an example of a very complicated scientific phenomenon. Don't spend time your first time reading the passage. If you don't understand it, like in the middle of the paragraph, if you're not really understanding exactly what the example is saying, but you know it's an example, that's enough to move on. Because the questions are going to ask you things like, how did the author build their argument? If they say, what role did that sentence play in that paragraph? You're going to choose the answer choice that says, it was an example. You don't have to understand like the underlying subject matter behind it. And so once you start tracking like the way the author is presenting the material, I think that takes a lot of pressure off of like truly understanding the material. So that's my first suggestion, is to avoid getting stuck in the details in the middle of paragraphs and just marking down or highlighting like this is an example, or rather this is a counter argument. I can't tell you how many times I've read passages where I'm like, okay, I don't understand the argument, and I definitely don't understand the counter argument. That's okay. If you know it's a counter argument, that's good enough. And so one way to keep track of that, and a lot of my students will just have scratch paper and they'll just jot down like paragraph 1, like scribble the problem, and then like 2 and 3 were examples, and 4 was like an outlier. And generally, like all the passages will have the first passage being about like setting up either the context, and then like the second and third paragraphs, middle paragraphs, generally, what was I going to say? Oh, present the problem. And as I mentioned, you want to be asking yourself, is the author giving examples? Is the author criticizing something to make his point? Is the author simply stating facts? Just like in logical reasoning, you would notice, oh, this is just a set of facts. There's no conclusion. Is the author just stating facts? Looking for the presentation is super helpful. The other way to get through reading comp faster is by hanging on to the transition words. So I tell my students, like, you can basically skim, but you want to like hit the brakes when you see transition words. So if you see like additionally, or for example, despite this, however, unfortunately, surprisingly, if you're getting transition phrases or words, those are the places you want to pay attention to, because those are signaling the author's opinion, or like the way the author is thinking. So a lot of students will spend time focusing on like the details, but you can't guess what details the LSAT is going to ask you about in the answer choices. There's going to be so many times where you spend a lot of time trying to figure something out and then just not get asked about it, and you just wasted a bunch of time. But you can you can guarantee that they're going to ask you about the author's opinion and how they structured the passage. And so thinking about hanging on to the transition words or transition phrases instead of the details can help you get through those really tricky, like scientific passages a lot faster. And so I guess it sounds like, and I think like the theme here is just paying attention to the right things. So to get through reading comp faster, you want to pay more attention, spend more time on the structure, and waste less time on details. And the more you practice that, the faster it will get. I hope that helped, Kayla. Galaviz, if you look up Law Hub, or it should be on the LSAC page, but it's called Law Hub, but you log into it with your same LSAC account. And then on the left-hand side, you'll see test prep. But just look up Law Hub. There's probably a link for it on the homepage of LSAC. But you log into LSAC that way. My timing is horrible. Take it next month. Any suggestions? Hi, Brianna. Um, I would think about first where you're spending the most time. Are you spending the most time? Are you spending a lot of time rereading answer choices, or are you spending a lot of time rereading the stimulus? Um, are you spending a lot of time taking notes? Um, Thinking about where you're spending the most time is going to be your number one thing. This actually is probably, that is the number one thing. So that's the first thing I would do. The second thing I would do is review indicator words. So if you just Google like LSAT indicator words, reviewing like conclusion and premise indicator words and memorizing them if you haven't memorized them, will help a lot too, because those become like flags for your brain to hold on to. So those would probably be my two suggestions. One, figuring out, are you spending too much time on the answer choices or on the stimulus? Because I always tell my students, if you're staring at the answer choices, you're staring at the wrong place. Your answer's not going to pop up in your answer choices. If you're looking at the answer choices and you're thinking none of them look right or all of them look right, there's it's not fun to admit this, but there's obviously something you missed in the stimulus. So you want to go back and reread the stimulus. On the flip side, if you're spending a lot of time understanding every single sentence and every single detail in the stimulus, but then the question only asks about like the last sentence, and then you just wasted a bunch of extra time. So it's a balance to figure out how much time you need to spend. But I always tell my students that if you can understand the structure, then you can go on to your answer choices. Shaka, aren't logic games not on it? You're right, logic games aren't on it anymore. This is for logical reasoning. Some people do. I have my students do diagramming for logical reasoning. Some tutors don't have students do it, but this is some example of, I was going through my whiteboards with my students, and this was one from when we were diagramming. But yeah, logic games are not on it anymore. But I hope that was helpful, Brianna. So yeah, I would next time you take a section, pay attention to where you're spending the most time, and then also trying to adjust where you're spending the most time. So if you're staring at the answer choices a lot, then for a long time, then you want to get in the habit of reminding yourself to go back to the stimulus. Okay, guys, thanks so much for joining. This was a really good and productive live. I feel like I got a lot of really good questions. I'll probably go live tomorrow. I'll probably talk about trying to figure out what my live schedule is for the week again tomorrow. But that's just the nature of studying with me. But I'm going to try to figure out something, as I always say. But I will definitely be going live on Monday. So keep a lookout for that. But if you have any questions in the meantime, I have a link in my bio if you want to ask me any questions. So feel free to click that link, and it's just like you can submit a question to me. So if you have like a specific test question you want explained, or like you don't understand an answer choice or something, you can ask that. And also, I'm going to upload this live to my YouTube. I haven't going live on my YouTube. I might start going live on my YouTube, but anyway, all my live replays are on my YouTube. So you can look for that. They'll probably be updated tomorrow, most likely. But if you have any ideas or requests, feel free to leave them in the comments, and definitely check out my profile if you're studying for the LSAT. Because I think there's a lot of really good tips on there. Thank you guys so much for the gifts and the likes. I hope this was helpful. I'm glad I got to chat with you guys a little bit. Make sure to please follow and like if this was helpful. Thank you guys. Have a good rest of your Saturday night. And gosh, thanks for spending your Saturday night with me. Alexia, I am going to post, I just went over a bunch of reading comp tips. I'm going to post this on YouTube. On my YouTube, it's the same name, LSAT Machine. Check that tomorrow, and you can watch my comments then, because I gave a bunch of them throughout. Yeah, no problem. All right, guys, have a good Saturday night. Make sure you take time to relax. I hope this is the last LSAT thing you do tonight. Bye, guys.